Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the bakery counter at 4 in the morning and told herself she was not afraid. The pies were lined up behind her. 11 of them, perfect golden, still warm, and she had exactly 47 cents left to her name. She picked up the first crate, felt the weight of it pull against her back, and walked out the door into the Harlow Creek heat without looking behind her. She had stopped looking behind her the day they buried Thomas. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop the name of your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to Harlow Creek, Texas, the way most hard things come, without warning and without apology. By the time July arrived, the ground had cracked open in long, dry seams along the main road, and the air smelled like hot iron and horse sweat from morning until night. The town itself was the kind of place that looked decent enough from a distance. Storefronts with painted signs, a church with a real bell, a courthouse built from limestone that the county judge liked to mention at every opportunity. But Harlow Creek had a way of treating certain people that the painted signs and the church bell couldn't quite cover up, and Clara Whitmore had been learning that lesson for the better part of 2 years. She was 38 years old. She was heavy, not in the soft, apologetic way women were sometimes permitted to be, but solidly, undeniably heavy. The kind of woman who took up space without permission, and had spent most of her adult life being made to feel that this was a moral failing rather than a physical fact. She had Thomas's bakery, and she had her hands, and she had a stubbornness that her mother had called a curse, and that Clara had quietly decided was the only thing keeping her vertical. Thomas Whitmore had died 14 months ago, of what Doc Hennessy called a bad heart, and since then, Clara had run the bakery alone, paid every bill she could reach, and let the ones she couldn't reach stack up on the corner of the counter, like an accusation she wasn't ready to answer. The peach pies had taken her 11 days. Not 11 days of casual effort. 11 days of waking before the sun, of hauling crates of peaches from the Dobbins farm, 2 miles out, of cutting and sugaring and crimping until her fingers cramped and her back ached in ways she'd stopped mentioning to anyone, because there was no one left to mention it to. She had calculated very carefully on a piece of paper she kept folded inside her apron pocket that if she sold all 11 pies at the market price, she would have enough to cover what she owed Cyrus Hale's bank on the bakery property and have a little left over, enough to buy flour, enough to start again. She loaded the crates onto the wagon herself. She drove the 2 blocks to the main street herself. She set up the folding table herself, spreading the cloth Thomas's mother had embroidered with small yellow flowers, arranging the pies so the lattice crusts faced forward, because she knew they were beautiful, and she was not above using that. The street was already busy by 8 in the morning. Women in bonnets moved between storefronts. A group of ranch hands stood outside the feed store, passing a canteen between them and saying things to each other that made them laugh too loud. Clara kept her eyes on her pies and her hands clasped in front of her on the table and waited. She had sold 3 by 9 o'clock. 3 pies. Real money, actual coins, pressed into her palm by Mrs. Alderton from the schoolhouse and by old Pete Garza, who bought one every time she set up a table and never haggled on the price. She felt something dangerous beginning to stir in her chest, something that might have been hope, and she pressed it down carefully, the way you press down a crust before it goes into the oven, so it doesn't puff up and disappoint you later. She didn't see Ray Cutler until he was already at the table. He was one of Hale's ranch hands, which meant he had a certain permission in this town that was never written down anywhere but was understood by everybody. He was tall and loose-limbed and had the kind of face that had probably been handsome once before cruelty got into it and rearranged things. He stopped in front of her table with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked at the pies and then looked at Clara with an expression that made her jaw tighten. "These yours," he said. "They are," Clara said. "Huh." He picked up one of the pies without asking, turned it over like it was a horseshoe he was checking for wear. "Thomas Whitmore's fat wife, right? Heard you've been trying to hold on to that bakery." Clara said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence was sometimes the only armor a woman had, and she wore it now like something she'd paid for. "How much?" Cutler said. 40 cents, Clara said. Same as the sign. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He set the pie down not gently and then reached out with one hand and tipped the front of the crate. It happened fast. The way things that destroy you always happen fast, so fast that you're still standing there with your hands open and your mouth not yet formed around the sound of the thing when the damage is already done. The crate tipped forward. 4 pies came off the table and hit the dirt of Harlow Creek's main street. The lattice crusts shattered. The peach filling spread dark and wet into the dust. The remaining pies, 7 of them still in their tins on the table, stayed put. But it didn't matter because the fall had knocked her display cloth sideways, and one of the tins had rolled, and Clara was already moving around the table, already kneeling in the dirt, already trying to salvage something from the wreckage. "Shoot," Cutler said above her. "Clumsy." He said it flat without inflection like he was remarking on the weather. People had stopped. A woman with a market basket. 2 boys sitting on the feed store steps. The group of ranch hands who were now watching with the particular quality of attention men give to things they find entertaining. Nobody moved toward Clara. Nobody said anything to Cutler. Clara was on her knees in the main street dirt of Harlow Creek, Texas, and the town of Harlow Creek, Texas, stood around her in a ring of comfortable silence and watched. She did not cry. She would not cry in front of Ray Cutler on the main street of Harlow Creek. She picked up pieces of broken crust. She tried to lift one of the pie tins and found it had been dented by the fall. She kept her eyes down and her breathing even and her hands moving because moving was the only thing she knew how to do when the world did what the world did. "Somebody ought to tell the widow Whitmore," Cutler said loud enough for the watching crowd, "that baking pies ain't gonna save a property she can't pay for. Might be time to accept the situation." "I'll accept," Clara said very quietly, still not looking up, "whatever I earn." Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that later, that her voice did not shake. Cutler laughed. Someone else laughed. A third person made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something less comfortable. And then a different voice spoke. It came from the edge of the crowd. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to compete for space, because it occupied space naturally, the way a stone wall occupies space without effort and without apology. "Pick them up," the voice said. Clara looked up. The man was standing at the edge of the crowd, where the other spectators had arranged themselves into a comfortable semicircle of non-involvement. He was dressed in black from hat to boot, not the theatrical black of a man trying to make a point, but the worn, functional black of a man who had chosen a color and committed to it. He was somewhere past 40, with a face that had been shaped by weather, and by something harder than weather, and he was looking at Ray Cutler with an expression that Clara would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to herself, and never quite managing. He wasn't angry. That was the strange thing. He wasn't angry the way men get angry in the street with their chests out and their voices raised. He was something quieter than angry, something more final. Cutler turned. "You talking to me?" "Pick them up," the man said again. Same tone, same pace, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. "I don't know who you think you are, mister. I know who I am," the man said. "Question is whether you're going to pick up what you knocked over, or whether this conversation is going to take a different direction." There was a silence on the main street of Harlow Creek that Clara felt in her sternum. Cutler looked at the man. The man looked at Cutler. The crowd, which had been so comfortable in its watching a moment ago, suddenly found things to look at in various other directions. Cutler bent down. He picked up the broken pie tins one at a time and set them on the table beside Clara's remaining pies. He did it with the deliberate mechanical motion of a man who has decided that the particular fight being offered to him is not the one he wants today. When he straightened up, he looked at Clara once more, and then at the man in black, and then he walked away without another word. Clara stood up slowly. Her dress was dusty at the knees. Her hands were sticky with peach filling. She held herself very straight because she was not going to let the crowd see her fold. Not now. Not when something had just shifted in the air of this street that she didn't entirely understand yet. The man in black walked to her table. He looked at the remaining pies. He looked at the broken ones. He looked at Clara, and his gaze was a long time ago, not to pretend otherwise. "How much for what's left?" he said. Clara blinked. 7 pies at 40 cents each is $2.80. And the broken ones? They're not. Clara stopped. They're not fit for sale. How much did they cost you to make? That's not your concern, sir. No, he agreed. It isn't. How much? She told him. She didn't know afterward why she told him, except that there was something in the way he asked that didn't leave room for the usual performance of self-sufficiency that she'd been staging for 14 months. He reached into his coat and put coins on the table. Clara looked at them. She looked at him. That's too much, she said. For the broken ones too, he said. You'll find it's about right. I don't take charity. I know you don't. He looked at her steadily. I'm buying pies, all of them. That's not charity, Mrs. Whitmore. That's commerce. Clara felt something move through her that she could not name then and would only be able to name much later when she had enough distance from this morning to look at it clearly. She counted the coins. They were correct exactly, correct for 11 pies at the price she'd set, plus what it had cost her to make the broken ones calculated in flour and sugar and peaches and 12-hour days, a number she had never said aloud to anyone. You know my name, she said. I know most things about this town, he said. My name is Elias Grayson. I run the spread 8 miles south past the Cedar Ridge. You may have heard of it. Clara had heard of it. Everyone in Harlow Creek and the surrounding county had heard of Grayson Ranch. It was the largest operation in the territory, and had been for 20 years, going back to before Elias Grayson's time, built by his father, and expanded by Elias, in ways that had made him either respected or feared, depending on who in town you asked and how much they owed him. I've heard of it, Clara said. I have a proposition for you, Grayson said. Not here. When you're ready, and if you want to hear it. There's no obligation. Clara looked at the coins on the table. She looked at the empty street. Most of the crowd had dispersed now back to their errands and their comfortable mornings, now that the interesting part was over. She looked at the table with its yellow flowered cloth, and the 7 remaining pies, and the space where 4 had been. What kind of proposition? She said. I need someone to run my ranch kitchen, Grayson said. Permanently. I'll pay 3 times the wage you'd find in town, and you'll have full authority over everything that comes out of that kitchen. I don't interfere with the work of people I hire. I've found it makes for better results all around. Clara said nothing for a moment. She was adding things up in her head, not the money though. The money mattered. The money mattered enormously, but the other things. The variables of a situation she didn't fully understand. A man she'd met 15 minutes ago who knew her name and the size of her debts and was now offering her something that seemed on its surface too deliberate to be coincidence. Why me? She said. Grayson's expression didn't change. Because I've eaten 3 of your pies in the last year purchased through the bakery, and they were the best thing I've eaten in this county in longer than I can remember. And because, he paused brief and precise, a woman who gets on her knees in the dirt of a public street to save her work rather than abandon it, is a woman who understands what things are worth. That's not a common quality, Mrs. Whitmore. I'd rather employ it than watch it get used up on a situation that's working against her. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I still have the bakery, she said. I haven't lost it yet. No, Grayson said. You haven't. And that's your business, not mine. The offer stands whether or not that changes. You want to think on it, I understand. You know where the ranch is. He picked up the crate of pies, all 7 of them. The whole remaining weight of 11 days of work with the ease of a man accustomed to lifting heavy things, and he carried them to a wagon hitched at the side of the street. He tied the crate down with a length of rope from behind the seat, unhurried and methodical, and then he climbed up, took the reins, and looked back at Clara, standing at her empty table with her yellow flowered cloth and her handful of coins. He tipped his hat. A small gesture, completely genuine. Then he drove south toward the Cedar Ridge, and the sound of the wagon wheels on the hard-packed dirt of Harlow Creek's main street faded out until the street was quiet again, and Clara was alone with the coins in her hand and the broken pie tins stacked on her table. and something in her chest that she hadn't felt in 14 months. She stood there for a while in the July heat with the coins pressing into her palm. Then she began to fold the yellow flowered cloth. Carefully, the way Thomas's mother had taught her corner to corner, so the embroidery stayed on the inside and didn't catch on things. She had 47 cents when she'd set up this table this morning. She had considerably more than that now. She had enough to pay what she owed on the bakery for this month at least. She had enough for flour. She had enough to start again. But standing in the July heat of Harlow Creek with the cloth folded in her hands, Clara Whitmore found that starting again in the same direction she'd been going felt for the first time in 14 months like something other than the only option available to her. Ray Cutler had come back to pick up those tins. She had watched him do it. She had watched an entire street full of people who had been comfortable watching her kneel in the dirt become suddenly intensely interested in other things the moment Elias Grayson made his position known. She was thinking about what that meant. Not the man, she wasn't thinking about the man. Not yet, she was too practical for that, but what it meant that a single voice aimed in the right direction with the right quality of certainty behind it had moved a crowd that had been immovable. She put the folded cloth in the wagon. She picked up the broken pie tins, the ones Cutler had replaced on the table with his mechanical furious compliance, and she put those in too. She thought about Cyrus Hale's bank and the number on the paper in her apron pocket, and the fact that this month's payment would not cover next month's, and next month's would not cover the month after that, and the direction of the mathematics was one she'd been trying not to look at directly for the better part of a year. She thought about a kitchen she'd never seen, and a wage 3 times anything she could earn here, and a man she'd known for 15 minutes who had told her that watching her refuse to abandon her work had told him something about her character that he apparently found worth paying for. Clara Whitmore climbed up onto the wagon seat. She sat there for a moment in the July heat, looking at the main street of Harlow Creek, Texas, the painted storefronts, the limestone courthouse, the church with its bell, the feed store where a group of ranch hands were now paying very close attention to something in the opposite direction. She thought about Thomas, who had built the bakery with his own hands and believed in the essential goodness of people with a faith she had always privately considered optimistic to the point of danger. Then she picked up the reins and turned the horse toward home. She had a decision to make, and Clara Whitmore, who had spent 2 years being ground down by a town that had decided she wasn't worth much, found sitting in the July sun, with peach filling drying on her hands and coin in her pocket, and the memory of a stranger's unhurried voice rearranging the air of an entire street that for the first time in a very long time, she felt like the decision was actually hers to make. She made her decision on the way home, not slowly, not after long deliberation. Not the way people in stories make decisions, sitting by a window with rain on the glass and a cup of tea going cold while wisdom arrives like weather. Clara made her decision the way she did most things, practically without sentiment, with both hands on the reins and her eyes on the road in front of her. The numbers in her apron pocket didn't change. The bank didn't change. What Elias Grayson had said to her on the main street didn't change. And the fact that she had been running the same mathematics for 14 months and arriving at the same answer, not enough, never quite enough. That didn't change either. She would go to the ranch. She would hear the proposition in full. She would make no promises and sign nothing until she understood what she was walking into. Because Thomas had believed in the goodness of people, and Thomas was dead. And Clara had decided that his particular faith was not a thing she could afford to inherit, along with the bakery and the debt. She went home first. She washed the peach filling off her hands. She changed her dress. She stood in the bakery for a long moment, looking at the counter where the pies had been, at the empty space where 11 days of work had sat this morning in their tins, warm and golden and entirely hers. Then she went back out to the wagon and turned it south. The road to Grayson Ranch took her past the edge of town, past the cemetery where Thomas was, past 3 miles of scrub oak and dry creek bed before the Cedar Ridge came into view. Clara did not look at the cemetery as she passed it. She looked at the road. The ranch itself was not what she expected, and Clara would realize later that she had not known what she was expecting, only that whatever it wasn't this. The gate was plain. No ornament, no name carved into it, just solid timber, well made, hinged with iron that showed no rust. Beyond it, the buildings were arranged with a kind of considered order that spoke less of wealth displaying itself and more of a mind that had thought carefully about how people moved through a space and what they needed from it. There was a main house. There were outbuildings. There was a long, low structure to the east that she didn't recognize the purpose of at first. And there were women, not ranch hands, not servants moving quickly between tasks with their eyes down. Women, 6 of them, visible from the gate, moving with a purposefulness and a straightness of spine that Clara associated with people who had decided something important about themselves and intended to hold to it. A girl of maybe 20 came to meet the wagon at the gate. She had red hair and a direct gaze, and she said, "You'd be Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Grayson said you might come today. I'm June. I'll take your horse." "Thank you," Clara said. She climbed down from the wagon and felt the eyes of the women in the yard, brief and assessing, before they went back to their work. Grayson came out of the main house as she was crossing the yard. He had taken off his coat and hat and rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and he looked without the deliberate stillness of the street encounter, like a man who worked continuously and had simply paused for a moment rather than stopped. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you decided quickly." "The mathematics decided," Clara said. "I just drove the wagon." Something moved at the edge of his expression, not quite a smile. "Come inside. I'll show you the kitchen first. Everything else can wait until you've seen what you'd actually be agreeing to." The kitchen was the size of Clara's entire bakery, and then half again. It had 2 stoves, a thing she had never seen in a private residence, and a long work table of scrubbed pine and more storage than she'd had in 3 years of running her own operation. It was clean, with the specific cleanliness of a space that was used hard and maintained carefully, not the cleanliness of a room no one entered. Clara stood in the middle of it and didn't say anything for a moment. "The women on this ranch eat 3 meals a day at a common table," Grayson said from the doorway. "There are currently 18 of them. The hands eat separately. Meals for the hands have been handled by a rotation system that has been, in my estimation, an insult to the concept of food. That's a separate problem. The kitchen here, this one, is for the house and for the women in residence. It's the position I'm offering you." 18 women, Clara said. 18. "Who are they?" Grayson was quiet for a moment. He came into the kitchen and stood at the other end of the work table and looked at Clara with that same direct, unperforming gaze she'd encountered on the street. "That's a fair question, and you're entitled to an answer. Some of them came here because they had nowhere else to go. Some of them came because they heard there was a place they could come to. Some of them came because my wife brought them here before she died." Clara had not known he'd been married. She had not known he'd been widowed. She found herself recalibrating something, though she wasn't sure yet what. "Your wife," she said. "Margaret," he said. "She died 3 years ago. The women who came because of her, most of them stayed. They had reasons to stay that were stronger than grief, which is saying something because the grief was considerable." "What kind of reasons?" "The kind," Grayson said, "that make leaving more dangerous than staying." He said it simply, without drama, as a fact he had arranged his life around. Margaret believed that a woman who had no options was not a free person regardless of what the law said. She built something here that addressed that. I've tried to maintain it. Clara looked around the kitchen. She thought about the women in the yard, their straightness of spine, their purposeful movement. She thought about June at the gate with her red hair and her direct gaze meeting a stranger's wagon without hesitation or deference. "Why didn't you hire one of them to run this?" she said. "I did. She left 2 months ago to open her own operation in San Antonio. I've been without a head cook since then, and the situation has deteriorated." He paused. "I wasn't going to hire the first person who applied. I was waiting for someone specific." "Specific how?" "Someone who understood what this kitchen is for," Grayson said. "This isn't just feeding people. It's the kitchen is the center of what Margaret built here. The women gather in it. They learn in it. 2 of them have started their own small enterprises because of skills they developed in it. It matters in ways that go past the food." He looked at her directly. "When I saw your table on the main street this morning, I thought you might understand that." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was warm. Both stoves had been banked down, but not cold, and the smell of it was flour and iron, and something that reminded her so suddenly and so exactly that it momentarily took her breath of the bakery on the mornings when Thomas had still been in it. 3 times the town wage, she said. 3 times. Full authority over this kitchen. Full. And if I decide the arrangement isn't working, Clara said, I want 30 days' notice on either side, not less. Agreed. I want to keep the bakery, she said. I'm not abandoning it. I'll need to make arrangements for it, but it's mine and it stays mine. That's your business, Grayson said. I told you that this morning. Clara looked at him. She was trying to find the catch. There was always a catch. Thomas had been naive about that, but Clara was not, and she had learned in 14 months of widowhood that offers that seemed straightforward generally weren't, and the part that wasn't straightforward would reveal itself at the worst possible moment. Why are you doing this? She said. Not the kitchen, not the job. Why did you step in on the street this morning? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. Grayson was quiet for long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he said, My wife knelt in the dirt of a street in Austin in 1871 because a man knocked her parcels out of her hands and the people around her watched. I was there. I didn't know her yet. I did what I did this morning, and afterward she told me she'd have been fine without my interference, and she was probably right, and I married her 8 months later. He said it without sentiment, as a sequence of events that had arranged themselves into a life. I don't think a man should stand by and watch that happen. Not because women need rescuing, because standing by makes you complicit in the thing you watched, and I don't intend to be complicit. Clara thought about Margaret Grayson, who had knelt in the dirt of a street in Austin and told this man she would have been fine without him and married him anyway. She thought about what it meant to build a refuge for women on a working ranch in the middle of the Texas hill country and then die and leave it behind and trust someone to maintain it. All right, Clara said. All right, Grayson said. I'll need a day to make arrangements in town, she said. I can start the day after tomorrow. That's fine. And I want to meet the women today, Clara said. Before I agree to anything formally, I want to understand what I'm walking into. Something in Grayson's expression shifted then, not surprise exactly, but something that might have been recognition. I'll introduce you, he said. Their names came one at a time, attached to faces and histories that Clara would spend weeks sorting into proper order in her memory. Ruth, who was 46, and had the bearing of a woman who had once had considerable standing, and had decided that standing was less important than safety. Vera, who was young, maybe 22, and very quiet with hands that shook slightly when she carried things and eyes that checked exits, the way some people check the weather. Dottie, who was the ranch's unofficial bookkeeper, and who greeted Clara with a handshake that would have done credit to a banker. Nell and Sarah, who were sisters, and who finished each other's sentences, and who had come together and clearly intended to leave together when and if leaving was something they chose. And Margaret's women, the ones who had been here longest, who had come because Margaret Grayson had sent word through channels that Clara didn't yet understand that there was a place. These women were quieter about their histories. They were also, Clara noticed, the ones who moved most freely through the space of the ranch, who had claimed corners and rhythms and relationships with the land itself that spoke of having decided to stay. They ate dinner together that evening. Clara had not planned to stay for dinner, but June had put a plate in front of her without asking, and Dottie had pulled out the chair beside her with the casual authority of a woman who had decided the matter, and Clara had sat down. The food was adequate, and no more than adequate, which seemed to Clara a significant waste of a kitchen that size, but she kept that observation to herself for the moment. The conversation at the table was different from anything Clara had experienced in Harlow Creek in 14 months of widowhood. Women talking about work, real work, the logistics and economics of it, what they'd learned, and what they were trying next. Dottie describing a correspondence she'd had with a dry goods concern in Austin about a possible supply arrangement. Nell talking about the kitchen garden expansion she was planning for fall. The ease of it. the assumption built into the texture of every exchange that a woman's appeal is less remarkable than a man's. Clara sat in the middle of it and felt something she hadn't felt in such a long time that she almost didn't recognize it. She felt among people. She was quiet on the drive back to town. She stopped at the cemetery. She hadn't planned to, but she stopped. She sat on the wagon seat in the dark for a moment, looking at the gate. "I'm not abandoning anything," she said to Thomas, or to the idea of Thomas, or to the part of herself that kept Thomas's voice active in her memory as a check against her own impulses. "I'm just moving the operation." Thomas predictably had no objections. She went home and made her arrangements. She went to see Hobart Finch, who rented the building 2 doors down from the bakery and who had been after her for a year to let him use her ovens on the mornings she wasn't using them. She struck a deal with Hobart that would keep the bakery operating in her absence and ensure that the building stayed active enough to matter to the bank's calculations. She went to the bank. She paid what she owed for this month with Grayson's coins, which she spent without guilt, because they had been offered and she had earned them in 11 days of pre-dawn labor, and she informed the teller carefully and without emotion that she would be resuming regular payments. The teller, whose name was Arnold and who had been visibly uncomfortable every time Clara came into the bank for the last 6 months, seemed surprised. Clara chose not to examine why that surprised her. She went home, packed a trunk with what she needed, and went to sleep. She started at Grayson Ranch on a Wednesday. The first week was a process of understanding what she had walked into. Not the kitchen, the kitchen. She understood within the first day had taken its full measure and begun the process of reorganizing it according to principles she'd developed over years in her own operation. The kitchen was the easy part. The harder part was the community inside it, because Grayson had used the word kitchen and meant something much larger than a kitchen. He'd said the women gathered in it and learned in it, and he was right. And what he hadn't said, what Clara came to understand through the simple daily fact of being present, was that the kitchen was the beating heart of everything Margaret Grayson had built here, and that heart had been running without a center for 2 months, and the women had held it together through collective effort and stubbornness. But they were tired, and they were waiting for what Clara wasn't sure. She wasn't sure she was the thing they were waiting for. She wasn't sure of much in those first days, except the work which she was always sure of. She reorganized the pantry first, which took a day and a half, and produced strong opinions from most of the women about where various things should be kept, which Clara listened to and largely incorporated into her reorganization, because she was not interested in winning arguments about pantry organization, only in having a pantry that worked. She established a baking schedule that meant fresh bread at every meal, which Dottie described as a material improvement over the previous arrangement, in a tone that suggested she was being restrained in her assessment. She cooked the first Sunday dinner with Ruth and Vera, helping not because she'd asked them to, but because they'd appeared in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, and picked up tasks without discussion, which Clara understood to be an offer of a kind that deserved to be accepted. It was during that first Sunday dinner that Clara discovered what Dottie meant when she said the women had started enterprises of their own. Nell had a small egg operation, 30 chickens carefully managed with eggs sold to 3 families in town, through a boy named Henry, who drove a cart on Tuesdays. Sarah, her sister, had started making candles from the rendered fat of the ranch's beef operation, which she sold through the same channel. 2 of Margaret's women, Bess and Ida, had a quilting operation that had developed over 3 years into something that took orders from as far as San Antonio. These were not hobbies. These were functioning income streams operating quietly out of a ranch that most of Harlow Creek thought of, if they thought of it at all, as Grayson's spread. A cattle operation. A man's business. Clara sat with that knowledge for several days, turning it over. The way she turned dough, looking at its structure, testing its resistance, trying to understand what it was made of. On the Thursday of her second week, she was in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, an hour she'd kept since the bakery days, the hour she thought best when Grayson came in. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd put on and stood at the end of the work table and said, "You're learning things." "I am," Clara said. "Things I didn't tell you." "Things you didn't tell me," she confirmed. He looked at his coffee. Some of it I didn't tell you because it wasn't mine to tell. The women's arrangements are their own business. I understand that. Some of it, he said, I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it would make you run. Clara looked at him directly. What part of it do you think would have made me run? I don't know, Grayson said. I haven't determined yet what frightens you. The frankness of it stopped her. It was not a challenge, and it was not an intrusion. It was simply a statement of an observed fact that he had been watching her with the same attentiveness she'd been applying to understanding this place, and that he was further along in his assessment than she'd realized. Most things don't, Clara said after a moment. No, he agreed. I'm beginning to see that. He looked at her in that way he had direct without performance, without the quality of management that men's gazes usually carried. Do you want to know what Margaret intended this to become? Clara said yes. He told her. He told her over 2 cups of coffee at 5 in the morning in the kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and iron, while outside the day was beginning in the sounds of the ranch coming to life. Margaret Grayson had not simply intended to shelter women. She had intended to build an economic system, small yes, local yes, but real and self-sustaining, in which women who had been stripped of options could rebuild not just safety, but agency. The egg operation and the candles and the quilts were not accidents or hobbies. They were the first stages of something Margaret had mapped out over years with the careful detail of a woman who understood that the difference between charity and power was the difference between being given a thing and owning it. She had died before it was finished. She had left notes. Grayson had the notes kept in a leather case in the main house, and he had spent 3 years trying to understand them well enough to carry them forward. And he had come to understand that he could not do it alone, because the thing Margaret was building was not built by a man in a study reading notes. It was built in a kitchen, in a common room, in the daily accumulation of women deciding what they were capable of, and then finding out they were right. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she sat with it for a long moment. Then she said, "The bakery." Grayson looked at her. "My bakery in town," Clara said. "It has an oven and a commercial-grade work table and a street-facing location on the main road of Harlow Creek." She was speaking carefully, following a thought that was forming faster than she usually allowed thoughts to form. If it was part of a network instead of a standalone operation, if what Nell is doing with her eggs and what Bess and Ida are doing with their quilts was connected to a storefront in town that people actually knew about. She stopped. "Thomas built that bakery with his hands. I've been trying to save it as though saving it means keeping it exactly as it was. But Margaret's notes are yours to look at," Grayson said, "if you want them." Clara felt the thing in her chest that she'd been pressing down since the main street, since the coin, since the dinner table, and Dottie's dry assessment, and June with her direct gaze at the gate. She felt it rise now past the point where pressing it down was a reasonable option. It wasn't hope exactly. It was larger than hope, and more dangerous and more real. It was the recognition of a plan. She was still sitting with it, still turning it over when June burst into the kitchen with her red hair coming loose from its pins and her face carrying an expression that Clara had not yet seen on this ranch. Something close to fear, but sharper with an edge of warning in it. "Mr. Grayson," June said, "there's a man at the gate. Says he's from Hale's office. Says he's here about the Whitmore property." The temperature in the kitchen didn't change. The bread smell didn't change. But something shifted subtle and immediate, and Clara watched Grayson's face go very still, in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who has just heard something he was waiting to hear and is now deciding how to respond to it. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at Clara. "Hale's office," Clara said. "Cyrus Hale." "Yes," Grayson said. "He owns the bank," Clara said. "He owns the bank," Grayson said, "and 3 other properties on your street and a stake in the county water rights. And he has spent the last 4 years arranging things in this county in ways that the county has not entirely noticed yet." He said it steadily without heat. Your bakery is on a parcel of land that sits between two properties he already holds. He's been after it for 2 years. Clara felt the cold come in under the door of her understanding, the specific cold of a thing you should have seen sooner. Thomas didn't sell, she said. Thomas didn't sell. Grayson confirmed. And then Thomas died, Clara said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. A log shifted in the stove. Outside the ranch, sounds continued: horses, the distant voices of the morning, oblivious and ordinary. The way the world is always oblivious and ordinary, in the moments before the shape of something reveals itself. "What are you telling me?" Clara said. Her voice was very level. She needed it to be level. "I'm telling you what I know," Grayson said. "I don't have proof of anything beyond what I've just said. But I've been watching Cyrus Hale for 3 years, and Margaret was watching him for 2 years before that. And some of what's in those notes—" He stopped. "Some of what's in those notes is about Thomas," Clara said. "Yes," Grayson said. Clara sat with that. She sat with it the way you sit with a thing that is too large to move quickly, and too real to set aside, and too important to respond to with anything less than the full weight of your attention. Then she stood up. She smoothed her apron. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "Tell the man at the gate," Clara said, "that Mrs. Whitmore will see him in the main room in 10 minutes. Tell him she'll have questions. Tell him to be prepared to answer them." Grayson looked at her. "And tell him," Clara said, "that she is not alone." The man from Hale's office was named Prescott. He was thin and precise and carried a leather satchel that he set on the table in front of him, with the deliberate care of a man who understood that what was in it represented power, and wanted to make sure everyone in the room understood that too. He had the kind of face that had never once considered that it might be wrong about anything, and he sat in the main room of Grayson Ranch with his hands folded on top of his satchel, and waited for Clara with the patience of a man who expected waiting to be brief. He had not expected Grayson to be in the room. He had not expected Dottie, who had appeared from somewhere with a ledger under her arm and taken a seat in the corner with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had attended many meetings and knew exactly which ones required witnesses. He had not expected Clara to walk in the way she walked in. Not hurrying, not apologetic, with her hands at her sides, and her chin at the level it had been at when she was kneeling in the dirt of the main street, which was to say, level. "Mr. Prescott," she said, and sat across from him without being invited to. Prescott looked at Grayson. Grayson looked back at him with an expression that communicated pleasantly and without ambiguity that looking at him was not going to produce any assistance. "Mrs. Whitmore," Prescott said, "I represent the interests of Mr. Cyrus Hale, as you may have been told. I'm here on a straightforward matter regarding the property at 14 Main Street, Harlow Creek, the bakery formerly operated by your late husband, Thomas Whitmore." "I operate it," Clara said. "Not formerly. Currently." Prescott opened his satchel. He produced a document and slid it across the table toward her. "The bank holds a note on that property, Mrs. Whitmore, as I'm sure you're aware. The terms of the original loan stipulated repayment in full within 18 months of origination, or the property reverts to the bank's holdings. That 18-month period concluded 11 days ago." Clara looked at the document. She did not pick it up. "The terms I signed," she said carefully, "specified monthly payments with a final settlement at 24 months, not 18. The original terms were renegotiated in the spring of 1882, Prescott said. "Your husband signed an amendment at that time." "I was not informed of any amendment," Clara said. "Your husband was the primary signatory on the note," Prescott said, in the tone of a man delivering a fact so well established that questioning it was slightly impolite. "The amendment is fully executed and legally binding." Clara looked at the document for a long moment. She was doing something that looked from the outside like reading, and was from the inside something more like holding herself very still in the center of a situation that was moving fast in a direction she did not yet fully control. "May I see the amendment?" she said. Prescott produced a second document. Clara took it. She read it, actually read it, not the performance of reading, but the real work of it, moving through every line. It took her several minutes. No one in the room spoke. Then she set it down. "This is signed," she said, "on March the 4th, 1882. "That's correct. Thomas was in San Antonio on March the 4th, 1882, Clara said. "He was there for 11 days purchasing equipment. I have his letters from that trip. I have the receipts from the equipment purchase dated the 3rd through the 8th of March in San Antonio. He was not in Harlow Creek on March the 4th. The room was very quiet. Prescott's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of change. The stillness of it suddenly, where before, there had been the small habitual movements of a man comfortable in his position. "That is a significant claim, Mrs. Whitmore." "It is a documented fact, Mr. Prescott," Clara said, "which is different." She watched him make a decision. She could see it happening, the rapid internal calculation of a man reassessing the meeting he thought he'd been walking into. "Even if there were questions about the amendment," he said, and his voice was still smooth, still professional. "The underlying note remains. The debt is real. Mr. Hale is prepared to offer you a generous settlement, full market value for the property, which would clear your debts entirely and leave you with capital too." "No," Clara said. Just that. One word, flat and final as a door closing. Prescott looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think you fully appreciate the position." "I appreciate it exactly," Clara said. "Someone signed my husband's name to a document when my husband was in San Antonio. That document is being used to accelerate a debt that would otherwise not be due for 6 more months. And Cyrus Hale is offering to buy a property he has been trying to acquire for 2 years at a moment when he believes the person who stands between him and it is alone and out of options." She looked at Prescott with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely without warmth. "I appreciate the position perfectly, Mr. Prescott. My answer is no." Prescott put the documents back in his satchel. He stood up. He looked once at Grayson and then back at Clara, and what was in his face now was something that had not been there at the beginning of the meeting. Not quite anger, but the close cousin of anger. The thing that lives next to it when a man has been confidently wrong and would prefer not to examine that too carefully. "Mr. Hale will not make this offer again," Prescott said. "I'm counting on that," Clara said. He left. June, who had been in the hallway with no particular excuse for being there, closed the door behind him with a precision that was not quite a slam, but was in the family of slams. The room held its silence for approximately 4 seconds. Then Dottie said from her corner, "San Antonio, March 4th. You're certain?" "I kept every letter he wrote me," Clara said. "Every one. They're in a box in the bakery. I never threw away a single one." She looked at Grayson. "You knew about the amendment." "I suspected there was something," Grayson said. "Margaret's notes referenced irregularities in the bank's documentation on several properties. I didn't know the specifics of yours. What else is in Margaret's notes?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me." The leather case was in Grayson's study on the shelf behind his desk, between a surveying manual and a copy of the Texas property statutes that had been read so many times its spine had given up. He took it down and set it on the desk and opened it, and Clara saw that it was full, not disordered, but densely full with papers in Margaret Grayson's handwriting, covering everything from small folded notes to longer pages written in the tight economic hand of a woman who had learned to say a great deal in a small space. "She started this in 1879, Grayson said. "She'd been watching Hale since before that, but 1879 is when she began documenting it systematically. She was very intelligent, Margaret, more organized than I am, more patient." Clara picked up the first page. She read, "What Margaret Grayson had built in this leather case over 4 years was something that the women of Harlow Creek and the surrounding county would have recognized, and the men of Harlow Creek's courthouse would have found inconvenient a record. Property acquisitions cross-referenced with deaths and bankruptcies and sudden departures. Names, dates. The pattern of it, once you saw it, had the quality of something that had always been visible and simply hadn't been looked at directly. 6 properties in 4 years. In 5 of the 6 cases, the previous owner had died or left the county within 8 months of Hale's first approach. In 3 of those cases, the death had been documented as natural causes by Doc Hennessy, who also served as the county coroner, who also, Clara noticed, had his mortgage held by Hale's bank. Clara set the paper down. She picked up another, then another. "Thomas is in here," she said. "Yes," Grayson said. Margaret was watching Thomas's situation specifically. "Yes." Clara kept reading. She read for a long time. Grayson sat in the chair across the desk and let her read, which she understood was a form of respect, not interrupting the process, not managing her reaction, letting her arrive at the thing in her own time and her own way. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at the surface of the desk for a moment. "She thought he was going to come after Thomas," Clara said. "She thought he already had," Grayson said. "Thomas had refused to sell twice. Margaret wrote that she intended to speak with Thomas directly to warn him to encourage him to document the pressure Hale was applying. She died in February of 1882. He paused. Thomas died in October of 1882. 8 months. The same window as the others. Clara felt the cold move through her again, the same cold as in the kitchen, but deeper now with more of it and more specific. It was not grief. It was not the grief of Thomas's death, which she had already lived through and which lived in her now as something permanent and structural part of the architecture of who she was. This was something else. This was the particular cold of understanding that a thing you had believed was one shape was actually another shape, and that the difference between those shapes had consequences that were still unfolding. "Doc Hennessy said bad heart," Clara said. "Doc Hennessy says that Grayson said carefully with some frequency. Is there proof? Not the kind a court would accept. Not yet." He looked at her directly. "That's what Margaret was trying to build. She didn't get far enough. I've been trying to continue it, but I'm not the right person to be inside these women's lives and these properties and these transactions. Margaret understood things about how this worked that I'm still learning." Clara looked at the leather case. At 14 months of widowhood compressed into a new shape, a new explanation, an explanation that was in some ways worse than the one she'd been living with, because grief was something you could survive, something with a direction to it. But this was something that required a response. "You need a federal marshal," Clara said. "I've been in correspondence with a Marshal Briggs out of the Austin office for 4 months, Grayson said. "He's interested. He needs more than correspondence. He needs someone who can testify to specific incidents, specific documentation with standing in this county. Someone like the widow of a man whose death may not have been natural," Clara said. "Yes," Grayson said. "And you think that's why Hale is moving now?" Clara said. "The amendment, the meeting today, he knows you've been in contact with Briggs. He's trying to resolve the property question before an investigation gets close enough to make it complicated." "That's what I think," Grayson said. Clara stood up. She walked to the window, not to look out of it. She had learned the habit of moving when she thought, because stillness made thoughts feel final before they were ready to be, and she stood there with her back to the room and her hands clasped in front of her and worked through it. Thomas had been a good man, a genuinely good man, not in the idealized way of grief, but in the actual specific way of a person who woke up every morning and tried to do right by the people around him and mostly succeeded. He had built the bakery, and he had loved her, and he had refused to sell his land to a man who was using it to crush people smaller than himself, and that refusal had likely cost him his life. Clara had spent 14 months believing he'd died of a bad heart. She had spent 14 months grieving a loss that was in the story she'd been told simply the way of things, the random cruelty of a body giving out. She turned around. "I want to see Marshal Briggs," she said. "I can arrange that," Grayson said. "I want to bring the amendment document and the letters from Thomas's San Antonio trip," she said. "And I want Margaret's notes on the Whitmore property specifically." "All of that is manageable, and I want to know," Clara said, "what Hale does next. Because he's going to do something next. Prescott is going to go back to him and report this conversation, and Hale is going to understand that the situation is more complicated than he believed, and he's going to respond to that. She looked at Grayson steadily. Men like him always respond. Grayson nodded slow and certain. They do. So we need to be ready before he responds, Clara said. Not after. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the room June had set up for her in the second building, clean and plain, a bed and a chest and a window, and looked at the ceiling and did the mathematics of the situation, the way she did all mathematics, systematically, without sentiment, following each number to its conclusion, before moving to the next. Thomas. The amendment. Hale. Margaret's notes. Doc Hennessy and his mortgage. The pattern of 6 properties. The window of 8 months. She got up before 4 and went to the kitchen and started the bread and let the work of it, the specific physical grounding work of her hands in dough, slow the mathematics to a pace she could manage. Ruth found her there at 5, the way Ruth often found her there at 5, and poured herself coffee and sat at the end of the work table and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things Clara had come to appreciate about Ruth. She understood that some silences were working silences and didn't try to fill them. You found out something about your husband, Ruth said finally. Clara looked at her. What makes you say that? Because that's the only thing, Ruth said, that puts that particular look on a woman's face. Not fear, not anger. The look that's underneath both of those. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I had it myself once. Clara turned back to her bread. Did it get better? It got clearer, Ruth said. Which isn't the same thing as better, but it's more useful. Clara thought about that for a long time, working the dough, while the ranch came slowly alive around them, in the sounds she'd already begun to know June's voice, the horses, the distant rhythm of the day beginning. Clearer, not better, more useful. 3 days later, Hale came himself. He did not send Prescott. He came in a carriage his own with his initials on the door, and he came in the middle of the afternoon, which was a choice that communicated something. A choice that said he was not arriving for a quiet conversation. He was arriving to be seen arriving. He was a large man, Cyrus Hale, with the specific largeness of a man who had built himself deliberately, who wore his prosperity in every measurement of his physical presence. He had iron gray hair and hands that looked powerful, and a voice that Clara heard from across the yard before she'd come to the door. Smooth, carrying the voice of a man accustomed to being the loudest thing in any room he entered. He was talking to Grayson in the yard. Not arguing, talking with the specific ease of a man who believes that every conversation is one he controls by definition. Clara stood in the doorway of the main house and watched them, and she watched Grayson respond to whatever Hale was saying with the same quality of stillness he brought to everything, and she watched Hale's ease shift subtly as he found the stillness neither yielding nor agitated. Then Hale looked at the doorway and saw Clara, and his expression moved into something that was arranged to look like warmth and was not. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, walking toward her. I've been hoping for the chance to speak with you directly. Prescott is an efficient man, but he lacks a certain personal touch. I prefer to handle sensitive matters myself. That's considerate of you, Mr. Hale, Clara said. She did not move from the doorway. He stopped at a distance that was calculated to be close enough to feel like intimacy and far enough to be defensible. I understand Prescott's visit may have felt abrupt. I want to assure you that my interest in your property is entirely motivated by the fact that it sits between 2 parcels you already own and completes a land corridor you've been assembling since 1880, Clara said. A pause, very brief. I have business interests that are complex, yes, and by the fact that my husband refused to sell it to you twice, Clara said. Once in the spring of 1881 and once in December of that same year. I believe there may have been a third approach in early 1882, but my husband didn't mention it to me, and I only learned of it recently. Hale looked at her with an expression that was still arranged as warmth, but had developed at its edges something less comfortable. Mrs. Whitmore, I think you may have been given some information that... I'd like to ask you about the amendment to my husband's banknote, Clara said. The one signed March 4th, 1882, when Thomas was in San Antonio. The warmth left. Not dramatically, Hale was too controlled for drama, but it left the way heat leaves a room when a door is opened gradually and completely. What replaced it was not anger, not quite, but the face underneath the arrangement. And that face was a different thing than what it had been covering. "I don't discuss the bank's internal documentation in informal settings," Hale said. Clara said we should find a formal one. Grayson had come to stand at the edge of the conversation. He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was a statement all by itself, and Hale felt it. Clara could see him feel it, the way the situation had rearranged itself from what he'd walked into to what it now was. "You're making a mistake," Hale said, and his voice had dropped, and the smoothness was gone from it, and what was underneath was the thing that had always been underneath. "I've made plenty of those," Clara said. "This isn't one of them." Hale looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Grayson. He looked back at Clara, and in that look was an assessment, a recalculation, a man determining the shape of the obstacle in front of him and filing it away for future reference. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He walked back to his carriage. He climbed in. The driver moved the horses without being asked, which told Clara that Hale had told the driver to be ready to leave quickly, which told her that Hale had expected this visit to go exactly as it had gone, and had already decided what came next. She stood in the doorway until the carriage was out of sight. Then she turned around. Dottie was inside the hallway. Ruth was behind Dottie. June was on the stairs with her hands gripping the railing and her red hair loose, and her face carrying something that Clara recognized as fear only because she'd learned to recognize its specific shape in this house. Not the loud fear of immediate danger, but the quiet old experienced fear of a woman who had seen what men like Hale do when they've decided to stop being pleasant. "He's going to move fast now," June said. "Yes," Clara said. "What do we do?" Clara looked at Grayson. Grayson looked back at her with that expression that was not quite anything. She had a word for the expression that had started on the main street of Harlow Creek with a command to pick things up, and had been developing ever since into something that she did not yet have the vocabulary for, and was not at present going to look at directly. "We move faster," Clara said. She wrote to Marshall Briggs that same evening, using the correspondence address Grayson gave her, and she wrote it in her own name. Not Grayson's, not through an intermediary, but Clara Whitmore, widow, formerly of the Whitmore Bakery, Harlow Creek, Texas, currently in residence at Grayson Ranch. She laid out the facts in the order she'd assembled them. The amendment, the San Antonio letters, the pattern in Margaret's notes, Thomas's 2 refusals, the 8-month window, Doc Hennessy and his mortgage. She wrote it in the flat, specific language of someone who had spent 14 months running a business alone and had learned the difference between what she felt and what she could document, and she wrote only what she could document. She sealed the letter and gave it to Grayson to send on the morning courier, and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about Thomas. Not about his death. About him. The way he'd looked at her across the bakery counter on the morning he'd asked her to marry him, with more hope than confidence, which was the truest thing she'd ever seen on a human face. The way he'd said her name. The way he'd believed with a faith that had infuriated her and moved her in equal measure that the world was fundamentally decent and that decent people would prevail in it. She lay in the dark on the ranch of a widow she'd never met, surrounded by women who had survived things she was only beginning to understand, and she thought, "Thomas, you were not wrong. You were just early." The letter arrived from Prescott the next morning. Not a letter exactly, a formal notice on bank letterhead informing Mrs. Clara Whitmore that due to the outstanding debt on the property at 14 Main Street, Harlow Creek, and in accordance with the terms of the amended note dated March 4, 1882, the bank intended to initiate foreclosure proceedings in 14 days unless full payment of the outstanding balance was received. The outstanding balance was $460. Clara read the notice at the kitchen table with her coffee cup in her hand, and her face entirely still. Then she looked up at Grayson, who had read it over her shoulder, and was now standing at the end of the table with his arms crossed and his jaw set. 14 days, she said. Yes, he said. That's not enough time for Briggs to respond, let alone act, she said. No, he said. So Hale knows that, Clara said. He knows exactly what 14 days does and doesn't allow for. This isn't about the money. She set down her coffee cup. This is about the land. He wants it filed and settled before anyone with authority asks questions." "Yes," Grayson said. Clara looked at the notice. $460. An impossible number assembled from a fraudulent document designed to move faster than justice. She thought about the coins on the table in the main street. She thought about 11 days of work in the dirt. She thought about Thomas on March 4th in San Antonio, writing her letters she had kept every single one of not knowing that someone in Harlow Creek was signing his name to something he would never have signed. She thought about Margaret Grayson, who had seen this coming and died before she could stop it, and who had left a leather case full of careful notes and trusted someone to use them. "I'm going to need to go into town," Clara said. "I'll come with you," Grayson said. "I know," Clara said, "but I need you to understand something first." She looked at him steadily in the way she'd been learning to look at things on this ranch, without flinching, without the protective habit of looking slightly to the side. "This is my fight. You can stand beside me, but the standing needs to be beside, not in front." Grayson held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I know the difference." "Good," Clara said. And she picked up the notice and folded it along its original lines and put it in her apron pocket next to the piece of paper, with the mathematics next to the ghost of Thomas's hope, and she went to get her coat. They drove into Harlow Creek on a Thursday morning, and the town looked exactly as it always looked. The painted storefronts, the limestone courthouse, the church with its bell. And Clara looked at all of it from the wagon seat with new eyes, the eyes of a woman who now understood that a place could look one way on its surface and be something entirely different underneath, and that the difference between those two things was what men like Cyrus Hale built their empires on. Grayson drove. Clara sat beside him with her hands in her lap and the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket, and Thomas's San Antonio letters in the satchel at her feet, wrapped in cloth, the way she'd wrapped the yellow-flowered table cover carefully corner to corner, so nothing inside got damaged by the journey. She had also brought Margaret's notes. Not all of them, the full case, stayed at the ranch locked in the study, but the pages that referenced the Whitmore property specifically, and the pages that documented the pattern, and the page on which Margaret had written in her tight, careful hand the name of every property Hale had acquired since 1879, and the name of every person who had previously owned it and what had happened to them afterward. "First stop," Clara said, "is not the bank." "No," Grayson agreed. "First stop is Judge Alderman." Grayson glanced at her. "Alderman is complicated," Clara said. "I know, but he's the sitting judge, and he's the one who will preside over any foreclosure proceeding. And I want him to see the amendment document before Hale's attorneys file anything. I want it on record that I raised the question of its validity before the proceedings begin, not during them." "That's a sound instinct," Grayson said. "It's not an instinct," Clara said. "I thought it through last night." She'd thought it through most of the night. In fact, going back through everything she knew about how Harlow Creek worked, who owed what to whom, who was afraid of what, where the pressure points were in a system that had been designed to look like justice while functioning as something else. Judge Alderman was not a corrupt man. He was something more complicated than corrupt. He was a man who understood which way things ran in this county, and had made his accommodations with that over 20 years on the bench. Not from malice, but from the accumulated weight of small compromises that had eventually become the shape of his character. Clara knew men like him. She'd watched Thomas try to navigate them. The difference was that Thomas had believed in their fundamental decency and approached them accordingly. Clara was going to approach Alderman with documentation. He was in his chambers when they arrived. His clerk, a young man named Tate, who seemed surprised to see Clara Whitmore in the courthouse at 9 in the morning, showed them in after a wait of approximately 8 minutes, which was shorter than Clara had expected, and told her that Alderman had been sufficiently curious about her presence to not make her wait longer. Alderman was 62, with a face that had been shaped by decades of listening to people tell him things and deciding what to do with what they'd said. He looked at Clara when she came in, then at Grayson, then at the satchel with the practiced assessment of a man whose job was to evaluate what was in front of him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I understand you've had some dealings with Prescott recently." "Word travels quickly," Clara said. In Harlow Creek it does. Sit down. He nodded to Grayson with less warmth, but acceptable civility. Mr. Grayson? Clara sat. She opened the satchel, foreclosure notice on the desk first, then the amendment, then Thomas's letters from San Antonio, then the pages from Margaret's notes. Not all of them, just the ones about Thomas, just the documented facts, organized in the order in which the logic of them compelled the next question. Alderman looked at the stack. He did not touch it immediately. You're presenting me with something, he said. I'm presenting you with a question, Clara said. The amendment to my husband's banknote is signed on March 4th, 1882. These letters, she indicated Thomas's letters, are written from San Antonio between March 2nd and March 10th of that year. The postmarks are legible. Thomas was not in Harlow Creek on March 4th. He could not have signed this document. Alderman looked at the top letter. He picked it up slowly, carefully, and looked at the postmark. He set it down. He picked up the amendment. He read it. The chamber was very quiet. This is a serious allegation, Mrs. Whitmore, he said without looking up. It's a documented fact, Clara said, which I believe makes it more serious, not less. Alderman set the amendment down. He looked at her over the rims of his glasses with an expression she couldn't fully read. It was layered, and the layers had been accumulating for 20 years, and Clara was not naive enough to think she could excavate all of them in one morning. But there was something in the topmost layer that she recognized. It was the look of a man who had been suspecting something for a long time, and had now been handed the specific thing that made the suspicion real and uncomfortable and unavoidable. What are you asking me to do? He said. I'm asking you to note in the court record that the validity of the amendment has been formally challenged before any foreclosure proceeding is initiated, Clara said. I'm asking you to delay any filing until the signature can be examined, and I'm asking you, she paused just briefly, to be the judge you were elected to be. She had not planned to say that last part. It came out of her the way things came out when she had been holding them for too long past the point where planning could contain them. Alderman looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the papers on his desk. Leave these with me, he said. I have copies, Clara said. She did. She had made them the night before by lamplight in the kitchen, Dottie sitting across the table making a second set, while Clara made the first, both of them working in the quiet efficiency of women who understood that the value of documentation was in its redundancy. Of course you do, Alderman said with something that was not quite a smile, but was in its vicinity. I'll note the challenge. I'll need you to come back this afternoon to sign an affidavit formally attesting to the dates and the letters. He looked at Grayson. I assume you're prepared to appear as a supporting witness. I am, Grayson said. 3 o'clock, Alderman said. Both of you. They left the courthouse and stood in the morning sun, and Clara took one breath deep and deliberate before moving on to what came next. He'll tell Hale, Grayson said quietly. Yes, Clara said. I know. Before 3 o'clock. Probably before noon, Clara said. That's all right. I want Hale to know we went to Alderman. I want him to understand the direction this is moving. She picked up the satchel. Let's go to the telegraph office. The telegraph to Marshal Briggs took less time to compose than Clara expected. She had organized it in her head during the wagon ride, and she sent it under her own name, referencing her letter of 3 days ago, and the foreclosure notice, and the 14-day window, and the fact that she had now formally challenged the amendment before the sitting judge. She requested acknowledgement and asked for a response timeline. The telegraph operator, a man named Gibbs, who had been in that office for 12 years and had developed the professional discretion of a man who read everyone's communications, and pretended he hadn't accepted the message and the payment without comment. His eyes, though, moved over the words with the quick, involuntary attention of a man encountering something that surprised him, and Clara noted that and filed it away. She and Grayson were crossing back toward the wagon when Ray Cutler stepped off the feed store porch. Not accidentally. He stepped off the porch in the deliberate way of a man who has been waiting on it and has seen what he was waiting for and is now executing a plan. He was alone. No other ranch hands. No audience. And that was different from the last time, different enough that Clara felt the difference in the shift of the air between them. He stopped in front of them. He looked at Clara. He looked at Grayson. He looked at Clara again, and in his face was something she hadn't seen there before. Not the loose cruelty of a man performing for a crowd, but something tighter and more private. "You went to the courthouse," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Cutler," Clara said. "Hale's going to know by 10, Cutler said. "He'll have his attorneys file an emergency proceeding before your 3 o'clock. He's done it before, judge or no judge." He said it in a flat voice like he was reading something off a card he didn't write himself. Clara looked at him carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" Cutler's jaw worked for a moment. "Because I knocked those pies over," he said. "And I've been doing things for that man for 6 years because I needed the work, and I told myself it wasn't my business and—" He stopped. His face went through something she couldn't name. "He told me to. Knock them over. Told me you'd been told to leave the bakery property and hadn't, and a public embarrassment might move things along. He used those words, move things along." He looked at the ground and then back at Clara. "I didn't know then what I was moving along toward." The street was not as empty as it appeared. Clara had learned that about Harlow Creek, it was never as empty as it appeared, because people in small towns watch from windows and from doorways, and from the corners of their eyes, and they file things away, the way Gibbs filed telegrams with practiced pretense of not having seen what they saw. "Would you say that Clara said, under oath?" Cutler looked at her. His face was the face of a man at a crossroads. Not the theatrical crossroads of a man in a story, but the real kind, the kind that is fundamentally undramatic and extremely serious, and will determine who he is from this point forward. "I'd say it," he said. "If it came to that, I'd say it." Clara nodded. "Then be at the courthouse at 3 o'clock. Ask for Judge Alderman's clerk. Tell him Mrs. Whitmore sent you." Cutler nodded once, the same mechanical motion as when he'd picked up the pie tins, except that this time the mechanics of it were carrying something different. He stepped back. He went back to the feed store porch. He sat down on it with the particular stillness of a man who has made a decision and is now waiting for himself to catch up to it. Grayson waited until they were back at the wagon before he said, "You knew." "I suspected," Clara said, "from the main street. He knocked them over, but he couldn't hold his face right afterward. It was too deliberate and too fast, and he kept looking at specific things in the crowd, not at me." "That's a very precise observation," Grayson said. "I've been reading people in a bakery for 12 years, Clara said. "You learn what faces look like when they're working through something versus when they're reacting to something." They were back in the wagon when the response from Briggs came. Not a telegraph. Gibbs sent his boy running, which meant the response had been fast enough to catch them before they left, which meant Briggs had been waiting for exactly this kind of message. The boy handed the folded paper to Clara, and she read it, and then read it again. Briggs was already in Harlow Creek. Had been for 2 days quietly staying at a boarding house on the east side of town, waiting for the situation to develop to the point where his presence was both necessary and legally supportable. He would be at the courthouse at 3. He asked Clara to bring everything. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket and looked at Grayson. "He's already here," she said. Grayson absorbed that without visible surprise, which told Clara he'd suspected something like it, that his correspondence with Briggs had been more strategically coordinated than he'd described. She decided not to examine that too closely right now. The what of the situation was more immediately important than the how. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "What aren't you telling me about those notes?" The question came out flat and direct, and she watched it land on him, the way a flat stone lands on water, not sinking immediately, but not floating either. Grayson looked at the street in front of them. Then he said, "There's a page I didn't show you." "Show me now." He reached into his coat. He'd brought it separately folded and produced a single page folded twice. He handed it to Clara. She opened it. Margaret's handwriting, the same tight, careful hand. At the top of the page, a single line. "What I know and cannot yet prove." Below it, a list. 5 items. Clara read them in order. The first 3 were about properties and documentation and the pattern she'd already seen. The fourth was about Doc Hennessy, more specific than the notes Clara had already read with dates of specific death certifications, and the specific language Hennessy had used in each language that was Margaret had written remarkably consistent across cases that should have presented differently. The fifth item was 2 sentences. E. knows something he has not told me about the circumstances of Margaret Aldervane's death in 1880. I believe this is connected. I have not asked him directly because I am afraid of what he will say. Clara read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then she looked at Grayson. He was looking at the street. Not avoiding her gaze, she'd never seen him avoid anything, but looking at the street the way a man looks at something when he is deciding how to say the thing he has been carrying for long enough that it has become part of his posture. Margaret Aldervane, Clara said. Who was she? She owned the property directly east of yours on Main Street, Grayson said. She died in November of 1880. Doc Hennessy certified it as natural causes. He stopped. She was my wife's closest friend. She was the reason Margaret began the notes in the first place. And what do you know, Clara said carefully, that Margaret didn't ask you directly? I was there, Grayson said. The night Margaret Aldervane died, I was at her house. I'd come to help her move documents she'd been keeping for Margaret, our Margaret documents about a property dispute she'd been involved in with Hale. When I arrived, she was already... He stopped. She was still alive, barely. She said one thing to me before she lost consciousness. She said Hale's man had been there. She said he'd brought papers, and she'd refused to sign, and then he'd... He stopped again. Grayson, Clara said. She died an hour later, he said. And I went to the sheriff, and I told him what she'd said. And he told me she'd been ill for weeks, and that the delirium of dying women was not evidence. And he was right that it wasn't evidence. It was a dying woman's last words, and the law does not know what to do with those. Clara sat with that. The wagon was still. The street moved around them, ordinary Thursday morning commerce people moving between their errands, oblivious in the way of people who have not yet looked at the thing that has always been in front of them. You've been carrying that for 4 years, Clara said. Yes, Grayson said. And you didn't put it in your correspondence with Briggs. It's not evidence, Grayson said. It's my account of what a dying woman said to me. Hale's attorneys would destroy it in 20 minutes, and it would discredit everything else. But if Briggs knows the pattern, Clara said, thinking fast now, following the mathematics, and if Hennessy's certifications are as consistent as Margaret documented, and if we can demonstrate that the amendment is fraudulent, then what you heard becomes context, not evidence. It shapes the investigation without being its foundation. Grayson looked at her. He had the expression he sometimes wore when she'd said something that arrived at a place he'd been trying to reach from a different direction. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. Then tell Briggs everything, Clara said. At 3 o'clock, all of it, what you told me just now. She held his gaze. You have been building this case for 3 years, Grayson. You've been doing it carefully and legally, and you've been protecting the parts that could get torn apart by keeping them close. I understand that. But it's 3 o'clock today, or it's 14 days, and a foreclosure, and Hale files and moves on, and the window closes. I know, he said. Then we're agreed, Clara said. She got down from the wagon. She straightened her coat. She stood on the main street of Harlow Creek, Texas, in the July sun, and she looked at the bakery 2 blocks east. She could see the sign from here. Thomas Whitmore Baker in the painted letters Thomas had been so proud of, and she looked at it the way she had stopped allowing herself to look at it for 14 months, which was to say directly without flinching with the full weight of what it meant to her. Then she turned toward the courthouse and started walking. She did not wait for Grayson to tie the horse. She heard him behind her within 30 seconds, his footsteps even, and unhurried, and that steadiness was a thing she felt in her chest without examining it. Alderman's clerk looked surprised to see them back before noon. We need to add something to the affidavit, Clara said. And I need you to note that there will be additional witnesses at 3 o'clock, one of whom is Ray Cutler, currently employed at the Hale Ranch operation, and one of whom is Federal Marshal Briggs. The clerk looked at her. He looked at Grayson. He picked up his pen. At 10 past noon, they were in the courthouse anteroom when the door opened, and Hale's attorneys, Two of them in suits that announced their cost came in with a filing that they delivered to the clerk with the brisk efficiency of men who had done this before and expected the same outcome as before. Emergency proceeding, foreclosure. The Whitmore property. Clara stood up from the bench. "Mr. Alderman should be aware," she said to the clerk in a voice that carried clearly to the attorneys, "that the underlying document has been formally challenged and that Marshal Briggs will be present at 3 o'clock with documentation from the federal office." One of the attorneys, the taller one, turned to look at her. He had the face of a man who had walked into a room expecting it to be a certain way and found it rearranged. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you'd be well advised to consult with your own legal counsel before—" "I'd be well advised to do many things," Clara said pleasantly. "I'm choosing this one first." She sat back down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the clerk, who was now in the particular position of a man with two contradictory filings and a marshal coming at 3, and she watched him make the decision that the situation arranged as it now was really only permitted one answer to. "I'll need to bring this to the judge," the clerk said. "Of course," Clara said. The attorneys exchanged a look. The look was the kind that passes between men when they've encountered an obstacle they need to report back to the person who sent them, and they're working through how to frame it. Then they left. Quickly, quietly, with the controlled speed of men who had somewhere urgent to be. Grayson sat down beside Clara on the bench. He said nothing. They sat in the anteroom of the Harlow Creek Courthouse, in the noon heat, and waited. The way you wait when you have done everything you can do up to the moment you're in, and now the moment has to do its own work. 14 days, Clara said to no one in particular. 10 now, Grayson said. He'll come after you next, Clara said. If this moves forward, he'll look for a way to make it about the ranch, about Margaret's notes. He'll try to discredit the documentation by discrediting the source. Let him try, Grayson said. Clara looked at him. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, in the posture of a man who had made his accommodations with uncertainty and was no longer spending energy fighting it. There was something in that posture that she had been seeing for 3 weeks and not naming, and was still not ready to name, but which she admitted to herself in the anteroom of the courthouse on a Thursday in July, beginning to rely on in ways that had nothing to do with property disputes or legal filings. I want to thank you, she said, for what you did on the main street 3 weeks ago. Grayson looked at her. You thanked me already. No, I didn't, Clara said. I accepted your money and I asked you suspicious questions and then I drove away. Something moved at the edge of his expression. That's true. I'm thanking you now, Clara said. Not for the money, for the other part, for standing there. She looked at her hands. I'd been invisible for 14 months, in this town, as a person. And then you spoke, and everyone on that street heard something they couldn't unhear, and I... She stopped. I'm not explaining this well. You're explaining it fine, Grayson said. I'd stopped believing I was worth being seen, Clara said. It came out quiet and completely honest the way things come out when you've stopped defending yourself against your own truth. And then you acted like I was. Like it was simply obvious. Like of course she's worth it. Like there was no question. She looked at him. That was the part. That was the part I'm thanking you for. Grayson looked at her for a long moment in the quiet anteroom, with the courthouse sounds around them. Footsteps, voices, a door somewhere, and his face did the thing it had been doing for 3 weeks. The thing she didn't yet have a word for. Clara, he said, and that was the first time he'd used her name, just her name without the Mrs. or the formality, and the sound of it was, she put it away. She put it in the place where she kept the things that needed more time than she had right now. 3 o'clock, she said. 3 o'clock, he agreed. The clock on the courthouse wall said 12:42. At 12:58, the clerk came back out with an expression that told Clara everything before he spoke a word. Judge Alderman will hear the challenge at 3 o'clock, the clerk said. The foreclosure filing is suspended pending the hearing. Clara nodded. She did not say anything. She did not let the relief show on her face because she was in the courthouse of Harlow Creek, Texas, and the hearing was not yet won, and Hale's attorneys were somewhere in this town recalibrating. And Cutler had not yet appeared, and Briggs she had not yet met, and Thomas was still dead, and the mathematics of the next 72 hours were still unresolved. But she allowed herself very briefly in the privacy of her own chest, the thing she had been pressing down since the main street. She allowed herself to feel it. Then she stood up. She straightened her coat. She looked at Grayson. "We have 2 hours," she said. "Tell me everything you know about Briggs." Marshal Briggs was not what Clara had pictured. She had pictured someone large and declarative, the kind of lawman who announced himself through doorways. What walked into the courthouse anteroom at 2:45 was a man of medium height with a quiet face and eyes that moved with the precise cataloging attention of someone who had spent 20 years being underestimated and had learned to make that work for him. He was perhaps 50, with the weathered look of a man who did most of his work outdoors and on horseback, and he carried a leather satchel that was almost identical to Prescott's, except that what was in it was not designed to threaten, it was designed to document. He shook Clara's hand first. That was the first thing she noticed. Not Grayson's hand. Hers. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your letter was one of the clearest pieces of correspondence I've received in 14 years of this work. You organized the facts well." "I had good source material," Clara said. "Margaret Grayson's notes. I'd like to see those this afternoon." He looked at Grayson with the measured respect of a man who has been in correspondence with someone and is now calibrating the real person against the written one. "Mr. Grayson, thank you for your patience with a process that has moved slower than either of us would have liked." "It moved at the speed it needed to move," Grayson said. "Mrs. Whitmore accelerated the timeline." Briggs looked at Clara with an expression that had something in it she recognized, not surprise exactly, but the adjustment a person makes when the thing in front of them is larger than the frame they'd prepared for it. "So I gathered," he said. "Tell me about this morning. Everything in order." She told him. He listened, the way good listeners listen, not filling the pauses, not rushing her forward, not signaling which parts he considered important, because a good listener knows that signaling importance shapes what comes next, and he wanted what came next to be unfiltered. When she finished, he asked 3 questions. They were precise questions aimed at the 3 specific places in her account where the evidence was thinnest and the interpretation most dependent on inference rather than documentation. She answered them honestly, including the honest answer of, "I don't know yet," to the third one, which was about the mechanism by which the amendment signature had been obtained. "The signature question is secondary," Briggs said. "What matters first is establishing that it couldn't have been Thomas Whitmore's signature on that date. The letters accomplish that. After that, the question of who did sign it and on whose instruction is where we go next." "Cutler is here," Grayson said. "He'll testify that Hale gave him specific instructions regarding Clara's table on the main street. That establishes a pattern of directed harassment. It establishes agency," Briggs said. "Which matters. Where is he?" June had come with them. This had not been planned. She had simply appeared at the wagon as they were leaving the ranch that morning and said, "I'm coming," in a tone that had not invited discussion, and Clara had looked at her red hair and her direct gaze and her hands that were steady and said, "All right." June had spent the morning in the hall outside Alderman's chambers, and she had spent the early afternoon locating Cutler and staying within visible distance of him in the way that a woman who has survived certain things knows to stay within visible distance of the things that matter. Cutler was in the courthouse hall. June brought him in. He looked different here, not smaller exactly, but less certain of his dimensions, the way people look in official spaces when the official space belongs to a proceeding that concerns them. He looked at Clara, and then at the floor, and then at Briggs. And when he looked at Briggs, something in his face settled into the expression of a man who has decided on a direction and is going to walk it regardless of what it costs him. "You're the marshal," Cutler said. "I am," Briggs said. "I've got things to say," Cutler said. "About Hale. About what he told me to do." He paused. "About other things he's had me do. Over 6 years." He stopped again, and the stopping was not uncertainty. It was the deep breath of a man about to go underwater. "I kept quiet because I needed the work. I kept quiet because I told myself it was between Hale and the people he was after, not my business. But I was there. I was present for things, and He looked at Clara. I knocked over those pies because he told me to, and I did it without thinking about who was on the other end of it, and I've been thinking about it every day since. Clara looked at him steadily. Tell Marshal Briggs what you know, she said. All of it. That's all you need to do right now. They were in Alderman's courtroom at 3 o'clock exactly. It was not a full trial. It was a challenge hearing a procedural thing in theory, the kind of thing that happened in small courtrooms in small towns with a handful of people and a clerk taking notes. But the room had filled in ways that procedural hearings did not usually fill, because Harlow Creek was the kind of town where word moved faster than wagons, and by 2:45 the pews were occupied, not with Hale's people, though 2 of his attorneys sat at the front with their suits and their filed papers, but with the ordinary people of the town, the women with their market baskets, and the men from the feed store, and Mrs. Alderton from the schoolhouse, and Pete Garza, who bought a pie every time, and old Hennessy himself in the back with his hands in his lap, and his face carrying the expression of a man who is not sure why he came but came anyway. Clara sat at the table facing the bench, and she did not look at any of them. She looked at Alderman when he came in, and she held the satchel on her lap and waited. Alderman called the hearing to order. He acknowledged the foreclosure filing. He acknowledged the formal challenge. He acknowledged with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing his words in front of witnesses, the presence of Federal Marshal Briggs as an observer with jurisdiction. Hale's senior attorney, the taller one whose name was Croft, stood immediately. Your Honor, the presence of a federal marshal in what is a straightforward civil property matter raises questions of appropriate jurisdiction that Marshal Briggs is here as an observer, Alderman said. He is not intervening in these proceedings. He is observing them. That is within his authority. Sit down, Mr. Croft. Croft sat. His face was controlled, but his hands on the table were not entirely controlled, and Clara watched them and found the watching useful. Mrs. Whitmore, Alderman said, you've filed a formal challenge to the validity of the amendment attached to the loan note on the property at 14 Main Street. Please present your basis. Clara stood. She had thought about whether to stand or remain seated, and she had decided on standing not for the theater of it, but because she had spent 14 months being invisible in this town, and she was going to be visible today, entirely, deliberately, without apology. She laid out the letters first. She identified each one by date and postmark, and the content that established Thomas's location. She read 2 passages, brief ones, specific ones that placed Thomas in San Antonio beyond dispute. She presented the amendment with its March 4th date. She did not editorialize. She stated facts in sequence and let the sequence do what sequences do when the facts in them are real. The signature on this amendment, she said, was not made by my husband. My husband was in San Antonio. These letters with their postmarks establish that beyond what I believe any reasonable examination of the evidence could dispute. Croft was on his feet. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore's account of her husband's whereabouts is based on personal letters of uncertain provenance. The postmarks are United States Postal Service postmarks, Clara said without raising her voice. They are government documents, Mr. Croft. If you'd like to dispute the veracity of federal postal records, Marshal Briggs may have thoughts on that. There was a sound in the room. Not a laugh. The room was too serious for a laugh. But the sound that a room makes when something has landed cleanly and the people in it have registered it. Alderman did not suppress the sound. He let it run its course. Continue, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. She presented Margaret's notes next. She had organized them the way Briggs had suggested in the 2 hours before the hearing, not as an accusation, not as a narrative, but as a documented pattern, the same way a surveyor presents measurements, property by property, date by date. The name of the previous owner, and what had happened to them, and the name the property now operated under. She let the pattern speak because the pattern was the argument, and she did not need to dress it in language that a good attorney could pick apart. When she set the last page down, the room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being patient. The different quiet of people who have just seen something that has rearranged the room they thought they were sitting in. She heard from the back of the courtroom a sound that might have been Hennessy shifting in his seat. Croft made his arguments. They were competent arguments, the arguments of a man working with limited material and considerable skill. Questions of provenance, questions of interpretation, questions of whether a pattern was a pattern, or simply the natural turbulence of property transactions in a growing county. Clara listened to each one with the same attention she'd given to Briggs's questions, the same honest assessment of where the ground was softest. Then Cutler testified. He stood in the witness position, and he kept his hands still and his voice level, and he said what Hale had told him to do on the morning of the pies, and he said what else Hale had told him to do in the 6 years he'd worked at the Hale operation, and he said the names and the dates and the specifics with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who has been carrying something too long and has finally put it down in the only place it can actually be set down. Croft tried to discredit him. Croft was good at discrediting people. It was a specific skill, and he'd practiced it, and he found the places in Cutler's account where the memory was less precise and the interpretation more personal, and he pressed on them hard and methodically. And then Cutler said a thing that Croft had not expected. He told me to watch the widow Whitmore's bakery, Cutler said. Specific orders after Thomas died. Watch who comes and goes. Report if she meets with anyone from outside the county. Report if she gets a lawyer. He said... Cutler stopped. He looked at his hands. He said Thomas Whitmore had been a problem, and the widow was not going to be a problem. He used those words. Thomas Whitmore had been a problem. The courtroom did not make a sound. Clara felt it move through her. Not the surprise of it she had been following. The mathematics, and the mathematics had always pointed here. But the specific weight of hearing it said aloud in a public room by a witness under oath with a federal marshal sitting 3 feet away, writing in his notebook. The specific weight of a thing that had been true in the dark being made true in the light. She did not cry. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood, and she breathed steadily, and she looked at the bench where Alderman was writing, and she let the moment be what it was. From the back of the room, Hennessy stood up. Nobody had expected that. Croft hadn't expected it. Briggs turned. Alderman looked up. Clara turned in her seat and saw the old doctor standing in the back pew with his hands at his sides and his face doing something she had never seen on a doctor's face. Not the careful, professional composure of a man accustomed to delivering news, but something stripped down to what was underneath the composure, something that had been living underneath it for a long time. Your Honor, Hennessy said, and his voice was the voice of a man who is old and tired and has been carrying a weight that belongs in this room, not in his chest. I'd like to address the court. Alderman looked at him for a long moment. Dr. Hennessy, do you have relevant testimony? I have a correction to make, Hennessy said. To several death certifications I issued between 1879 and 1882. I need to correct the record on the cause of death listed in 3 of those certifications, including the certification issued for Thomas Whitmore. The room went the kind of silent that happens when the air itself stops moving. Croft was standing. His mouth was open. He closed it. He opened it again. Nothing useful came out of it. Briggs had his notebook open and his pen moving before Hennessy finished his second sentence. Alderman said, Dr. Hennessy, I need to advise you that anything you state in this proceeding may have consequences for you professionally and potentially legally, and that you have the right to. I understand that, Hennessy said. He was still standing in the back pew, not moving toward the front, as though he'd gotten to his feet, and this was as far as he'd decided to go, and it was going to be enough. I've understood it for 3 years. I'm making the correction anyway. He looked at Clara, past all the heads between them directly at her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. I knew Thomas Whitmore. He was a good man. I had no business signing what I signed. Clara looked at him. She did not say anything for a moment. The room was holding its breath, and she was holding something larger than her breath. She was holding the last 14 months, all of it. The grief and the mathematics, and the yellow-flowered cloth, and the bakery at 4 a.m, and the coins on the table, and 11 days of work in the July heat. Thank you, doctor, she said finally, and her voice was steady, and it was the hardest thing she had done in 3 weeks to keep it that way. What followed was not fast. Justice is not fast. Clara had known this, going in had told herself this repeatedly in the 2 hours before 3 o'clock, to prevent herself from expecting a thing that the world did not actually deliver. What followed was procedural and deliberate, and populated with language that moved slowly through channels and left documentation at every point of passage. Alderman suspended the foreclosure proceeding indefinitely pending investigation. He noted formally in the court record that the amendment's validity was under challenge and that the challenge was supported by documentation and sworn testimony. He acknowledged Briggs's jurisdiction and invited the marshal's formal participation in what he was now characterizing carefully and with the precise legal language of a man who understood both what he was doing and what it would cost him as a matter of potential criminal fraud. Croft and his colleague left the courtroom before Alderman had finished. Not dramatically, they simply gathered their papers and walked out, which was a different kind of statement than staying and arguing. Outside the courthouse, Clara stood in the late afternoon sun and felt the particular exhaustion of a body that has been running on something other than rest for longer than was strictly sustainable. Grayson stood beside her. June was on the steps below them talking to Briggs with the focused attention of a woman who had understood halfway through the hearing that there were implications for the other women at the ranch and was already beginning to map them. "It's not over," Clara said, not to Grayson specifically, to the air. "No," Grayson said, "but it's different now." "He'll fight it," Clara said. "Hale. He has money and attorneys, and he's been doing this for years. He'll find an angle." "He will," Grayson said. "And Briggs will be watching every move he makes from this point forward with the weight of a federal investigation behind him. That changes the mathematics." Clara smiled at that, a small, brief, real smile, the kind that comes from being understood rather than from anything being easy. She hadn't told Grayson she thought in mathematics. He had arrived at the language himself. Briggs came up the steps toward them. He looked at Clara with the same direct assessment as the anteroom and said, "I'm going to need you to formally sign an affidavit incorporating everything presented today, plus your personal account of the conversation with Hale when he came to the ranch. I'll need it before I leave Harlow Creek." "Tomorrow morning," Clara said. "That works." He looked at Grayson. "I'm also going to need access to the full set of Margaret Grayson's notes, not copies, the originals." "They'll be available," Grayson said. Briggs nodded. He looked back at Clara with something in his expression that wasn't exactly admiration. It was more considered than admiration, more specific. "You understand this is going to be a long process," he said. "Months, potentially. Men like Hale have resources. The investigation will be thorough, and it will be challenged at every stage." "I understand," Clara said, "and you're prepared to see it through." "Marshal Briggs," Clara said, "I baked 11 pies in 11 days on the last of my flour and my last 47 cents, and carried them into the main street of this town because I was not prepared to be finished. Yes, I'm prepared to see it through." Briggs looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "Good," and went back down the steps. The months that followed were exactly what Briggs had promised, long, difficult, contested at every turn by attorneys who were skilled at making legitimate process feel like obstruction, and obstruction feel like legitimate process. Hale filed counter-challenges. He challenged the provenance of Margaret's notes. He challenged Cutler's credibility. He challenged the chain of custody on the San Antonio letters with a persistence that would have been impressive if it hadn't been aimed at destroying a dead man's reputation. None of it worked, because Clara had documentation. She had Margaret's meticulous record built over 4 years by a woman who had understood that the only thing that outlasts power is careful, specific truth. She had Hennessy's corrected certifications filed with both the county and the state medical board, each correction a stone in the wall that Hale was trying to get around. She had Cutler's testimony, which he gave 3 more times in 3 different proceedings, with the same flat, exhausted consistency of a man who has decided that honesty is now his only available direction and is going to walk it all the way to the end. And she had herself. She testified twice in formal proceedings and once in a deposition that Hale's attorneys ran for 4 hours in the hope of finding an inconsistency in her account that they could use to destabilize the rest. They did not find one. Clara sat in that deposition room for 4 hours, with her hands flat on the table, and answered every question with the same steadiness she'd brought to the courtroom and the anteroom, and the morning she'd knelt in the dirt of the main street and decided not to cry. Afterward, Briggs told her that her deposition was going to be used as a teaching example for how to give testimony. She thanked him and went home and slept for 11 hours, which was the longest she'd slept since Thomas died. The ranch was where she went home to. This had happened gradually without announcement, the way most of the real things in Clara's life happened, not through decision exactly, but through the accumulation of small facts that added up to a direction. She was there every day. She ran the kitchen every day. She had hired 3 women from town, 2 of them widows, one of them a woman who had left a situation that she didn't describe and that Clara didn't ask about, because she had learned from Margaret's example that the door of this place was open, and the questions were secondary to the opening. The bakery stayed hers. Hobart Finch ran it on the terms they'd agreed, and he ran it honestly, and Clara went in twice a week to review the accounts and adjust the supply orders, and sometimes to bake early in the morning when she needed the specific grounding of her hands in dough, and the smell of the ovens, and the physical memory of Thomas moving around the counter. She had looked at the note on the bakery wall, a small one in Thomas's handwriting, pinned near the door that said simply, "Keep going." And she had looked at it for a long time on one of those early mornings, with her hands still warm from the dough, and she had said to him quietly in the empty bakery, with the light coming through the front window, "I'm going. I'm just going in a different direction than you planned." She thought he would have understood that. The kitchen at Grayson Ranch expanded. This was Clara's doing her specific contribution to the thing Margaret had started. Not the vision of it. Margaret had the vision, but the execution of it. The practical transformation of a vision into a system that worked on an ordinary Tuesday when no one was watching. And the thing still had to produce what it was supposed to produce. She brought Nell's egg operation into a formal supply arrangement with 4 businesses in town, which tripled Nell's income and reduced her dependence on the boy with the cart to a secondary rather than primary channel. She helped Bess and Ida formalize their quilting operation with a contract that gave them ownership of the design work, which was a thing they hadn't known they could claim, and which turned out to matter considerably when a textile merchant from San Antonio came through Harlow Creek and expressed interest in their patterns. She established a training schedule in the kitchen. Not formal instruction. Nothing that felt like a schoolroom, but the natural transmission of knowledge that happens when experienced hands work alongside less experienced ones, and both parties understand that what's being transferred is more than technique. And she began carefully to build what she'd described to Grayson that morning over coffee. The connection between the ranch and the bakery. The network that turned 2 separate operations into something that was larger than either one alone. Whitmore pies appeared on the menu at the Harlow Creek Hotel 6 months after the courthouse hearing. This was Dottie's doing. She had identified the hotel as an anchor client and had written the proposal and delivered it personally with a sample box that Clara had baked and that Dottie had carried the 8 miles to town in her lap to prevent damage. The hotel manager, a man named Forsyth, who had been running a commercial kitchen with mediocre results for 4 years, tasted the pies and said yes before Dottie finished the pricing discussion. 3 months after that, Whitmore pies were in 2 hotels and a restaurant in the next county, and Clara had hired 2 women from the ranch to help with production, and was paying them a wage that she had calculated specifically and deliberately to be enough to live on independently. Not comfortably. This was Texas in 1883. And comfort was not yet what the mathematics supported, but enough. Enough was the foundation. Enough was where everything else started. Hale was indicted in the spring of 1884. The indictment covered 7 counts, including fraud conspiracy, and 2 counts related to the suspicious circumstances of deaths that Hennessy's corrected certifications had reopened for investigation. The trial was in Austin, not Harlow Creek, because Briggs had determined that the local court's entanglement with Hale's interests made Harlow Creek an unsuitable venue, and Alderman had agreed with a relief that Clara understood was genuine, and that she had come to extend a certain respect to a man who had made his accommodations with power, and then, when given a specific opportunity and a specific reason, had chosen differently. Clara testified at the Austin trial for 2 days. She stayed in a boarding house, and she walked to the courthouse every morning in clothes she had made herself, not performing anything, not trying to look a particular way, just dressed in the way that felt true to who she was, which was a woman from Harlow Creek, Texas, who ran a kitchen and a small business empire and had decided what she was worth and was going to communicate that decision to anyone who looked at her. On the second day of her testimony, she was asked by the prosecuting attorney to describe the moment on the main street when her pies were knocked over. She described it. She described it in the same flat, specific language she'd learned to use for documentation: the time of morning, the heat, the position of the crowd, the sound the crates made when they hit the dirt, the way the peach filling spread into the dust of the street. She described getting on her knees to pick up the pieces. She described not crying. The prosecuting attorney asked, "And what did you think in that moment about your situation?" Clara paused. It was the first pause she'd allowed herself in 2 days of testimony. "I thought," she said, "that I was not finished." Hale was convicted on 5 of the 7 counts. He was sentenced in June of 1884, and his operations in Harlow Creek were placed under receivership pending resolution of the civil claims against them. 3 of the properties he'd acquired through the methods Margaret had documented were returned to their previous owners or their estates. The Whitmore Bakery, against which the fraudulent amendment was formally voided, remained Clara's unencumbered, clear of debt. She heard the verdict from Briggs, who had ridden to the ranch to tell her in person. He stood in the kitchen doorway while she was making bread, and he said, "Guilty on 5 counts. Mrs. Whitmore." And she stood at the work table with her hands in the dough, and she nodded, and she said, "Thank you, Marshal." And she kept working because the bread needed another 8 minutes, and bread does not wait for verdicts. Briggs watched her for a moment, and then he said, "Margaret Grayson would have been pleased." And Clara said, "Yes, I think she would have." After he left, she stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Margaret, who had never met her and had left her a leather case full of careful truth and trusted it to someone who hadn't been born yet, into the person who could use it. She thought about the main street and the dirt and the 11 pies and the 47 cents and the sound of one voice in a crowd that had decided to be silent. Then she went back to the bread. It was September when Grayson said what he'd been not saying for 11 months. He said it in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, which was where they'd had most of the real conversations of the preceding year, in that hour before the ranch came fully alive, when it was just the bread smell and the iron smell and the quality of honesty that comes with very early mornings. He said, "I'd like to court you properly, Clara, if you're willing. If you're not, I'd like to know that too, and I'll adjust accordingly. But I'd rather know than not." Clara looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment in the way she'd learned to look at things on this ranch directly, without flinching with the full weight of her attention. She said, "I'm not the woman who knelt in the dirt on the main street." "No," Grayson said, "you're not." "I'm not in need of saving," she said. "I haven't been for some time." "I know that," he said. "I'm not interested in saving you. I'm interested in you." "I have the bakery," she said, "and the kitchen here, and the network which is going to expand to a 3rd county before the year is out, and that's going to require more of my time and attention, not less." "I know that too," he said. "And I'm not going to become something smaller or quieter or more convenient in order to fit into a different shape," Clara said. "I spent 14 months becoming exactly this, and I'm not undoing any of it." "Clara," Grayson said, with the patient steadiness that was as much a part of him as the black coat and the unhurried voice, "I'm asking to court you. I'm not asking you to undo anything. I'm asking if I can stand beside you while you continue becoming whatever comes next." Clara looked at him. She thought about Margaret Aldervane in Austin kneeling in the dirt of a different street, who had told this man she'd have been fine without his interference, and who had married him anyway, and who had built something extraordinary in the years between, and who had left it behind in careful handwriting for someone she'd never met to continue. She thought about Margaret's trust in the possibility of the person who would come after her. She thought about what it meant to trust the future, when the present was hard to build anyway, to document anyway, to believe that careful truth outlasts power. She thought about Thomas, who had believed in the goodness of people with a faith she'd always called optimistic to the point of danger. She thought about how she'd been wrong about that. It wasn't optimism. It was a different kind of courage. "All right," Clara said. "All right," Grayson said. The kitchen smelled like bread. The ranch was waking up around them in its familiar sounds. Outside, the cedar ridge was beginning to catch the first edge of the morning light, and the day was assembling itself from its component pieces, the way days do, without ceremony, without announcement, simply becoming. Clara Whitmore turned back to her bread and let it become. The woman who had knelt in the dirt of Harlow Creek's main street on a July morning with 47 cents and 11 broken pies and 14 months of accumulated invisibility had not been saved. She had not been rescued. She had stood up on her own feet by her own decision, with her own hands still sticky with peach filling. And she had done the most dangerous and irreversible thing a person can do in a world that has decided they are worth nothing. She had chosen to disagree, and in that disagreement built carefully and documented thoroughly and defended in courtrooms and at kitchen tables and in the patient daily work of women deciding what they were capable of and then discovering they were right in all of it accumulated, like Margaret's notes, specific and real and permanent. Clara Whitmore had not merely survived the thing that had tried to diminish her. She had built something out of it that would outlast her the way Thomas's bakery had outlasted Thomas, the way Margaret's notes had outlasted Margaret, the way truth, carefully tended and stubbornly maintained, outlasts everything that tries to bury it in the dirt. She had been broken open in a public street, and what grew from the breaking was stronger than anything the breaking had tried to destroy. And in Harlow Creek, Texas, in the year of 1884, in a kitchen that smelled like bread and iron, and the particular hope of women who had decided to stop being invisible, Clara Whitmore was finally completely and on her own undeniable terms home.